So the story really starts in July 1793. Burns was a household name in Scotland by that time. He'd made a certain amount of money with the publication of his books. He'd had tours before, and they always started on a Saturday. And it was Saturday, the 27th of July 1793, that he and his great friend John Syme set out from Dumfries on ponies. They dined with the Glendinans at Parton, and then after dinner they walked up a small eminence and looked across to Aird's Wood to see where John Lowe, the famous poet of the time, had got the inspiration for his very famous song Mary's Dream, or Mary Weep No More for Me, which Burns absolutely adored. And Lowe, when he wrote that poem, lived in a cottage in Aird's Wood, and Burns and Syme wanted to see where Lowe had got this inspiration, and indeed had given his name to a small rock in the wood called Lowe's Seat, where he went for inspiration to write his poems and songs, overlooking the loch and with the wood in the background. So imagine the scene, looking across to Aird's Wood, and then behind it this alpine almost scenery that John Syme described in a letter later about the tour, and they would see the highest hill that overlooked the source of the Dee, which of course is from the poem Mary's Dream. John Syme and Burns continued on up the east bank of Loch Ken, which was smaller in those days before the Galloway Hydro Scheme enlarged it, of course. They then crossed the Ken and they came to Kenmure Castle behind us here, the seat of John Gordon of Kenmure and his wife. And then they spent 3 very happy days here, being guided by Dr. Robert Trotter of Dalry, who was the Muir doctor MacTaggart in his Gallividian Encyclopedia called him. And he was a very learned guy. He wrote novels and poems of his own, and he knew an awful lot about the historical aspects of the Glen Kens, and he was to be Syme and Burns's guide in the Glen Ken, together with the Reverend John Gillespie, who was patron of John Lowe in earlier times, and of course John Lowe, the poet that we referred to in relation to Mary's Dream. His father had been a gardener here at Kenmure Castle, so the Gordons knew John Lowe very well, and in fact he grew up here. Burns wrote a little poem celebrating the death of Lady Gordon's dog called Echo. It's very evident from reading that little poem that Burns wasn't greatly enamoured by the idea, and that comes across in the poem. And landscape-wise and map-wise, I can't stress enough how few trees there were in this area. And Francis Grose, who engraved the castle in 1791, bears this out. Burns had long cherished a wish to come and see the castle, and one can only think that that's because he had seen Grose's representation of it in that engraving that was in his Antiquities of Scotland, which of course also contained Burns's Tam O'Shanter. So having spent 3 wonderful days at Kenmure Castle, Burns and Syme, in company with Lord Kenmure, John Gordon, and John Gillespie, the Reverend John Gillespie, who he'd met at Kenmure Castle, set off on a boat, Lord Gordon of Kenmure's boat, the Glen Kens. It was a barge, and they set off on Loch Ken and came down from Kenmure Castle down to Aird's Wood to see again Lowe's Seat. And the story is the boat came to the Boat of Roan across the loch here, but the boat didn't quite get to the shore, and so the travellers had to get into the water, and Burns was wearing his new knee-length boots, leather knee-length boots at that time. He was very fashion conscious, Burns, actually, and a number of pen portraits talk about this of Burns in Edinburgh, that he dressed like a gentleman farmer or a ship's captain, and he wore a broad-brimmed hat and these knee-length boots, and he'd just got a new pair. Well, of course, the other travellers got out of the boat and went to the shore, but poor old Reverend John Gillespie was a bit too old for that, and Burns had to jump into the water and get a hold of the Reverend Gillespie and wade the last few yards to the shore, and of course that caused quite a bit of jocularity amongst the party. And of course Burns's boots got awfully wet, and they got further wet in the ensuing storm later that day, and resulting in the ruination of Burns's boots in Gatehouse. He took them off at night and he went to put them back on the next morning with a hangover, and they had shrank, and he had to cut them and couldn't get them on basically, and they were torn to shreds. They were repaired later in Dumfries apparently, but such is the story as has come down to us all these many years ago. And they headed over the hill road between Lauriston and Gatehouse, where they stayed in the Murray Arms. And local tradition has it that on the way they stopped at the Loch Change House, later to become the celebrated Loch Hotel, because what we have in front of us here is the celebrated Chalybeat spring, the Loch well, which was certainly known in Burns's day, but which became a really celebrated spa in years following Burns, and especially in late Georgian and Victorian times, and people came here literally in their droves to take the waters. It has salts of sulphur, magnesium and iron, and was a cure-all ills for a number of gut complaints, etc. But in landscape terms, the key thing here is that in Simon Burns's day, this was essentially an open landscape. In later times there's been a lovely double beech avenue planted all the way up to the hotel, but literally the old stories and accounts of the hotel talk about the trains being heard on the old paddy line from Dumfries to Stranraer, way down by Loch Skerrow, and essentially the landscape between here and there, several miles, was completely open, with only an odd hawthorn bush and tree beside some of the buildings, etc. But essentially it was an open landscape, and quite a wild landscape in Burns's day. But essentially on that journey across the wild moor, Syme reckons that was the greatest inspiration for Burns writing Scots Wha Hae, which he did, of course, within a few weeks of the end of his Galloway tour. Scots Wha Hae wi' Wallace bled, Scots whan Bruce has often led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front o' battle lower, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. Wha will be a traitor knave, wha can fill a coward's grave, wha sae base as be a slave, let him turn and flee. Wha for Scotland's king and law, freedom's sword will strongly draw, freeman stand or freeman fall, let him follow me. By oppression's woes and pains, by our sons in servile chains, we will drain our dearest veins, but they shall be free. Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do or die.